This tycoon left a shocking spike clause in his will. What was the golden egg that shattered his children's dreams? Wellington R. Burt was a man of new money. Having come from a humble farming background, every cent he went on to earn was carefully considered. Even in death, Burt worked on the family farm in the newly established state of Michigan from the age of 7. Then in 1843, at the age of 12, he became the farm's manager following the death of his father. But it wasn't the life Burt wanted. At 22, determined to fulfill his dream of seeing the world, he became a sailor. When he returned to Michigan 4 years later, he found the state poised on the precipice of the green gold rush. Wishing to jump on board the burgeoning timber industry boom, Burt opted to abandon his plans to return to the farm and instead took a job in a lumber camp. Described as tall, strong, and a man who knew how to give orders, it appeared that Burt had found his calling. Within a year, he had saved enough money to start his own lumber company. Less than a decade later, Burt's success had led him to found the Michigan community of Melbourne, naming it after his favorite Australian city. Melbourne grew to become one of the largest mills in the world. But in 1876, catastrophe struck when the mill was destroyed in a fire. Many believed Burt's fortune had come to an end. A shrewd businessman, this wouldn't be the case, for Burt already had other profitable timber land. He would soon expand into the iron mine industry and the salt industry. Foreign bonds, railroad, and bank investments followed. If there was money to be made, Wellington Burt would be there, even purchasing railways in Russia and China. These savvy investments and business deals would see Burt become one of the 8 wealthiest men in the United States for a time in the early 1900s, his social standing resulting in an additional career in politics. But despite his vast wealth and power, there was one thing Burt could never seem to acquire. With 7 children and a life most could only dream of, true happiness seemed out of reach. By the time he was an old man, Burt lived alone in a 3-story brick mansion in Michigan. As his eyesight and hearing failed, it was servants who cared for him. This social isolation would result in the nickname the Lone Pine of Michigan. When Burt died of senility in 1919 at the age of 87, his family and the local causes he had previously supported handsomely were in for a surprise when his will was read. With his wealth estimated to be between $40 and $90 million, there were set to be some incredibly wealthy beneficiaries. In the document, however, there was a spike clause, one that had been fondly described by the lumber tycoon as his golden egg. Nobody quite knew why Burt included the clause, but it was speculated to be the result of family feuds. The clause specified that his estate would only be dispersed to descendants who were unborn in Burt's lifetime. In other words, it wouldn't be distributed among his children or grandchildren, with the golden egg required to remain in its nest for 21 years after the death of his last surviving grandchild. Burt hadn't entirely forgotten his children. Apart from one favored son who would receive an annual amount of $30,000 and an unfavored daughter who received nothing, the rest of his children were to be given annuities of $1,000, the same amount provided to his cook, housekeeper, coachman, and chauffeur. His secretary was to receive $4,000. The will was received with shock not only by his children. During his lifetime, Burt had given very generously to his community, funding an auditorium, training school, hospital, and various charities. As a continuation to this generosity, he had devised millions to be left to the city when he died. But this plan was retracted 4 years prior to his death, when Saginaw officials increased his property assessment from $400,000 to $1 million. Whether inspired by bitterness or whether the legacy of Wellington R. Burt was indeed cursed, the golden egg had finally hatched. It would be almost a century later that the conditions of Burt's will were finally met. Following the death of his last grandchild in 1989, in May 2010, proceedings began to locate the intended beneficiaries. After quietly incubating for 92 years, the by now $110 million fortune was ready to be divided among 12 of Burt's descendants. Spread across the United States, none of the beneficiaries had ever met the man who was about to bestow them with a life-changing gift. With the money divided resulted in a formula intended to grant money based on those closest in generation to Burt and with the fewest siblings. For the recipients, the windfall came with mixed feelings. Christina Cameron was 19 when both she and her sister, Corey, were set to receive $3 million each, but the heiresses had little enthusiasm. Her grandfather had first been due to inherit the fortune, but died 2 years before. Then her mother, next in line, had died the previous year at the age of just 50. I guess all of this happening within a year made this seem more like a curse. My grandfather was pretty excited about it, and then my mother was pretty excited about it as well. Corey and I are not as excited.